Hi, I'm Craig Dumont with PentecostalPastor.com, and with me for another session discussing his book, Genesis as Torah, is Dr. Brian Peterson. And Brian, we kind of did an introduction to your book. Perhaps I talked too much. This time I'm really going to turn it over to you and let you, share with us some of your thinking as you have written through this. And I would recommend to pastors, we do these conversations on a regular basis, but I will tell you there's nothing like getting the book and reading it and then actually coming back for these discussions. But I would recommend that you buy the book. I know it's available by Kindle. I think you can, on Amazon. I know that you can buy it in soft cover, maybe even hardcover. It just came out though. It just recently came out. So I would just recommend that you would pick up Brian's books. Everything that he does is just outstanding work. What I enjoy is the fact that he is a scholar who does a lot of scholarly. I mean, there's no doubt that it is well researched. It is defendable from an academic standpoint. But on top of that, he is a man who believes God's word and acts on it. So I'm just thankful for that. So Brian, with that, I guess I'll hand this over. But maybe I'll just kidding. No. But Brian, let's get into the next chapter here. Okay. We did the kind of the introduction. What comes next here?
Well, after I set up my method of why I was doing what I was doing with reading the narratives of Torah, what I did is I actually began to apply it to Genesis 1 and 2. The first chapter are the foundational chapters of Torah. And I always say, you want to know what is the most important part of any book or any movie, for example. It's getting that first 5 minutes or 10 minutes to set everything up. Why is Torah set up with the first two chapters of Genesis? In the beginning, God. That's how it starts. This is the Ten Commandments, the first two. It's setting up very clearly in the beginning there is no other God. In a lot of the ancient Near Eastern myths, and I point this out, in a lot of the ancient Near Eastern myths, creation comes about by the interaction between one deity and another deity, and usually one stronger than the other.
Right.
Tiamat, for example, in Babylonian mythology, Tiamat and Marduk. And there's this massive battle, and out of that comes some type of form of creation, and it's usually built around the body of the god. And some of the other gods, their blood and whatnot. It's all very much earthly in its presentation. But in the biblical text, what you have, there's no fighting. There is no other God besides God. It is in the beginning, God created.
No chaos.
No chaos. If anything, what he's doing is chaos is meaningless to him.
Right.
The water could be classified as chaos. Like there was the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and there was in Hebrew tohu vavohu. It was formless and void. That's about as much chaos as you get. And in the ancient world, there's no question that the watery abyss was seen as chaos, but God just speaks to it. It's just a matter of speaking, and it splits. There is no fight that takes place. And what you're seeing in this opening chapter and where it becomes instruction for the Israelites is they may have been familiar with all of these ancient myths. But there's one thing that they're going to learn very quickly about their God. He is not like those ancient myths. And this is where I think that the whole context of ancient Egypt comes into play. We have, within scholarship, there is this argument that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were by two different authors. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that. Where you have Genesis 1 is what they call the priestly author, where they present Yahweh or God, in this case, as other. And he's outside and he just speaks things. He doesn't get his hands dirty. And then you have the second chapter, and they often put this to the Yahwist. And he is a relational God, or presents God in a relational way, and he gets down on his hands and knees and creates. And as I was reading this, I said, there's got to be a different explanation for this. Is that the only thing that's going on here? And then I begin to look at it within this context of ancient Egypt. Now remember, I believe it's Mosaic authorship.
Right.
If Moses is coming out of Egypt, say circa around 1446, if we go with an early date, so that's the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. If he is coming out at that time, the Israelites would have been exposed to all of the mythology of Egypt of that time period. Well, what I find fascinating is that within the 18th dynasty in particular, and I mean it's spread throughout a number of the dynasties, but in particular in the 18th dynasty, what we have is three creator deities, and two stand out. One is the god Ta, and he creates by speaking. The other god is the god Noom. He is known as the potter deity, and he creates the
what?
potter deity. In
pot-
other words,
okay.
kind of the potter's wheel,
Okay, yeah.
and he fashions, he literally is presented as fashioning the pharaoh on a
Okay.
potter's wheel, and then,
Wow.
putting life into him, and now pharaoh becomes the image of the deity.
Okay.
In this case,
Huh.
Ra. And so you have these two creator deities that are kind of very common at this time. One by speaking in the Memphis creation myth, and one potter god named Noom. Well, what do you see in the biblical text? If this is Mosaic, which I think it is, and the Israelites have been taught a certain way that, okay, there are these types of creator deities in ancient Egypt, I think Moses come along and say, hey, you want to know who the true creator who speaks things into existence is? It's not Ta.
Right.
It is actually Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, and he speaks things into creation. And just so you know that you may see Noom as the potter god who creates by fashioning clay on a potter's wheel, Genesis chapter 2. The language there changes in the Hebrew, that when it says he fashioned man, the language there is actually yatsar. Yatsar in Hebrew is a term that we get yotzer from, which is potter. And so here you have God coming down, taking clay, fashioning, much like a potter, fashioning man and breathing the breath of life into him. And so in that context alone, you have these two creation stories, and I'm not saying they didn't happen, but just the way they're presented. You have two creation stories that parallel Egyptian creation myths. And I think it's Moses setting the record straight.
Right.
Ta is not the guy who creates by speaking.
You know what? I'm sorry, I didn't
Yes.
mean. I'm just saying. That it's interesting because we read those myths and we think that Israel borrowed from them, and
Yes.
I think what happened is that Satan perverted the real. I mean, so you do have that potter type thing with man being made, and but Satan takes it and obviously wants to debase anything to do with God and make man a lower form deal, and so. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is. It's where Moses is. It's not that he borrows from it. He reclaims it. He said, "No, this." I mean, I think that's a powerful point.
Absolutely, and I think that what Moses does is he sets the record straight.
Yeah.
You have all this mythology. And remember, the Israelites are getting this Torah. They're getting this law prior to entering the Promised Land. Well, what's in the Promised Land? It's had Egyptian influence. They have grown up under Egyptian influence. And Canaan is under Egyptian hegemony at this time, and so plus you have Mesopotamian influence going on, and all of these myths that are going on around. And Moses is
So the Canaanites and all that. That's all under at least the Egyptian cultural influence.
Yeah, I mean, at this particular time, Thutmose III is what is often believed to be the pharaoh who began the oppression of the Israelites to the point where Moses has to run for his life under Thutmose III. Well, there's one thing that we know historically what Thutmose did. He actually subjugated Canaan.
Okay.
And so all of this land, as early as the 15th century, is under Egyptian hegemony. Well, part of that is going to be probably some of the instruction as well, how they understood creation. Now, obviously, the Canaanites would have their local traditions, but that still does not negate the fact that there is Egyptian influence.
Right.
And so all of this ancient Near Eastern influence, and Israel is in the midst of it. It's kind of like what we're dealing with today. You have Christian young men and young women who go to school. They have an upbringing of a certain manner within the home or within a church, but they are immersed in an anti-God culture.
Yeah.
And in some cases, not every case, but in some cases, anti-God teaching and instruction. Well, what sets it right? Hopefully the instruction at home, and hopefully the instruction in the pulpit. Well, in this case, here is Moses. He's recognizing all of these outside influences, and he's giving them Torah instruction. How do we understand creation? That's very fundamental. Where do we come from? Everybody wants to know, where did we come from and what are we here for?
Yeah.
And what you see in Genesis chapter 1 is he sets the record straight. He said, it is Elohim. It is God who has done this. And he has given us an important role to the point where he has made us in his image. And what's interesting, there's only one text that I know of in ancient Egypt where you actually have a deity creating man or woman in his image. and only in one place that I know of. Now, I'm not saying there might be possibly others,
Right.
but the one I'm familiar with. And so what you see is even that, I believe, Moses is trying to correct. We are made, in this case, the Israelites are made in the image of God, but in this image is not the image of Merikari.
Yeah.
It is the image of none other, or Ra, or whoever. It is the image of God incarnate.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned about man and woman, right in Genesis, in the midst of where women were anything but the equal. I mean, even if you did have some female goddesses, and you may have had some temple, prostitute. I mean, that's basically what they were used for. But I mean, you have God right at the very beginning saying, "This is the way that I created man and woman."
Yeah.
And I mean, and there is a incredible dignity, I mean, it's like a king and queen being made. I mean, there's no sense of that she's made to be a slave or a servant or to be trod underfoot. Right from day one, there's, I mean, that's got to be a big cultural hit to Egypt and to Canaan and everywhere else.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because again, the Noom, the potter god, creates the Pharaoh to rule in the place of the God. He is actually God incarnate. Well, what was man made to be? Man was made in the image of God to rule in his place in dominion on the earth. And in this case, you don't have just one, you actually have a pair that are created to be co-equal to rule and reign with God. That was the plan. It is a total kind of, while it has images or parallels to the Egyptian literature, what you're seeing is something that is totally fundamentally different, in the sense that they're not Pharaoh per se, but they are made in God's image. They are co-rulers with God. One of the other things what is interesting as far as this 18th dynasty, 15th century time period, is that archaeologists have actually found in the ancient mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, who I know one particular scholar, Eugene Merrill, a great scholar, used to teach at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's actually written a great book on the Kingdom of Priests. It's a history of ancient Israel. And he actually argues that Hatshepsut was the adoptive mother of Moses. Well, what's interesting is that in her mortuary temple, they have a 15-scene presentation of the creation of man, and I think it's around scene 8 and 9, right around there, you have Noom creating her on the potter's wheel. Now, they made these mortuary temples long before the Pharaoh died. They actually started, when they came to power, building their own mortuary temples. And so can you imagine if she is the adoptive mother of Moses, taking little Moses in there at 10, 12, 13 years old or whatever, walking in, and he's seeing this stuff. And now when he writes and being inspired by God, he is, again, setting the record straight. He has seen this potter god, I'm sure, growing up, but he's saying, look, Noom is not the creator. It is none other than Yahweh himself.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. So creation. So what we're going back to is Genesis 1 and 2. Without a good understanding, without being grounded in that. Again, I mean, I think, again, going back to your book, you mentioned how everybody learns stories, kind of like Sunday school stories, which, by the way, even though we should be learning them in Sunday school, that does not mean that they're insignificant or not true. We should be learning. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that today. I mean, we need more of that. But it seems like, it's like all those Sunday school stories, and in fact, many today haven't even heard those stories. We have to start there on everything. I mean, in terms of marriage, and even marriage laws. I don't know where we're going to go on in terms of that, but marriage laws would flow from there. The dignity of man, even how one man treats another man, how a man treats a woman, how a woman treats a man, all of that, and how man, of course, relates to God. It would, and I would just point out one more thing. You talked about that we were made to rule, and today a lot of people worry. They don't like the term the dominion mandate, and they think of it as being exploitive. But the dominion mandate was meant. I mean, essentially, man was to transform the world for God into something good. Something. I mean, basically, the Bible, today we're trying to preserve wilderness. The Bible always speaks of wilderness being something that's not that good.
Yeah.
In fact, he said, I'm going to let evil people live in there rather than let it turn into wilderness. Lest,
Yeah.
so it's interesting that we have to read that stuff to get our thinking straight all the way through, or we're going to even misunderstand straightforward laws.
Yeah, and I think that within our culture, and that's why I think this particular, what I've written is so appropriate for today. Within our Western culture, what are the very things that we have undermined in the past, say, 60 years? We have undermined the family, we have undermined marriage,
Right.
and now we have undermined what gender is. And what are the very first things, the Torah, that God has established for the Israelites? That He has created male and female. Good. That is God's plan. Then chapter 2, what does He do? He says, how does man and woman, He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
Right.
Then He gives them chapter 2, what is the context in which men and women can be fruitful and multiply? Covenant of marriage. Because He said, I've seen that it's not good that man be alone.
Right.
And so in this case, the very first fundamental things after the creation of everything is the establishment of the family. That is the bedrock of culture.
It's interesting that we see what's happening today is because we've denigrated marriage for so long, and people think they can do without it. We're seeing people get married later and later, and then they struggle with the family part.
With having family,
the family part. I mean, it's it's just, I just was thinking about that as you're saying. It's just interesting how, that we forget, the Bible says that God gives us children as an inheritance.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we look at them as, weights rather than as, as something to be, blessings.
Yeah, and I think that's where we come into chapter 2, when it's talking about that it was not good that man be alone, and how does humanity take part in the creation process? Because God didn't, He could have just created the whole earth full of people and been done with it.
Right.
But what He does is He allows Adam and Eve, He allows the first man and woman to be a part of the creative process to actually fill the earth.
Yeah.
And in this case, chapter 2, again, is that context where and anybody who's been at a wedding has heard Genesis 2:24 and 25. The man shall leave his mom and dad, shall cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Well, there is a move within scholarship today, especially with issues of same-sex marriage, that what you have here, Genesis chapter 1 may be talking about be fruitful and multiply, but Genesis chapter 2, that's talking about loneliness. And this is talking about just forming a kinship bond. And any two people can do that. Two men, two women, it doesn't really matter. And I said, that couldn't be farther from the truth, what God is actually doing here. Be fruitful and multiply. Now what's the context of how that is to be? Marriage. Animals cannot do this.
Right.
You cannot do it. That's why He said, and He brought all the animals to Adam, and no one was good as a helpmeet for him. Literally, the word in Hebrew there was none that was kenegdo, like in front of him, like fitting in front of him. That's literally what that word means. And so here you have Adam standing, and you have an animal, and this just does not fit.
Yeah.
And not to be crass, so what did He do? He created a helpmeet.
Yeah, and Brian, there's, as you say, I'm just thinking, and there's not one of them that even comes, I mean, let's just say the closest to man, whatever that may be, some type of
ape
creature is still going to be quantum leaps. I mean, there is nothing there. I mean, so this creation that God, I mean, when He sees this, that there's nothing even comes close.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be something where He goes, man, I mean, it's all, I mean, you almost think it's going to be depressing. He's thinking, and so it's almost like God sets him up. I don't know what the thing is, but it's like, okay, I'll show you what I'm going to do now.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the big surprise, the big reveal, right? and we often say that woman is the crowning creation of God, right? And He doesn't make her out of dirt. He makes her out of the side of Adam. But when the language that He uses there in the Hebrew is when he created her, He wanted to create a helpmeet that was kenegdo, like fitting or in front of Him. And so, one of pastors here a few months ago preached on this. There is this fittedness that goes between a man and a woman. Biologically, they're fitted. They were made to fit one another. Two women, it doesn't work that way. Two men, it doesn't work that way. And this argument that what we have here has nothing to do with procreation in chapter 2.
Right.
So as long as we have this kinship bond, it can work. And I was like, no, kinship bond is part of it. But he goes on to say, and not only the kenegdo, the fittedness, but he says, and the two shall become one flesh. Well, that's not just being one flesh in the sense of we're going to become together as a kinship bond. But one flesh for me is also, and I think that this is where that chapter 1, be fruitful and multiply, comes in. That one flesh now becomes your children. And I often joke, I said, you want it, when my first child was born, my little girl Madeline, when she was born, the nurse took one look at her and said, that is your daughter. Because it was that perfect blend of Christine and of me.
Yeah.
And that at that point, the two of us have become one flesh.
Yeah.
And that is what this is establishing. God is saying, you want to know, Israel, what is the heart of my creation and what is the most important part of my law? It is that you be fruitful and multiply, and you do it in the context of marriage, and that becomes the bedrock of society.
I'm going to go out on a limb here. Doesn't somewhere God speak to Abraham and said, I've given you children that I may establish my law or something? I'm
trying to remember exactly where.
Now I shouldn't have said that on camera. I could have been wrong, but
It's possible.
I think that there's some place where he says, I have given you children that my law may be established, and maybe it's meant because you're going to teach them.
I think I know what you're talking about in Genesis chapter 18,
Is it? Okay.
where he says, I must tell Abram what I'm going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah because I know that you are going to instruct the next generation.
Okay, is that what?
That you will be. Now that could be what you're talking about, and there's no question.
I don't know what I'm talking about. I never do.
But yeah, there is that one place where God looks at him and says, I'm telling you this for a reason. Because you're going to instruct the next generation of what not to do.
Yeah.
Or how to serve God properly. People don't look at that in that context. That's over in chapter 19 because no one wants to deal with that particular text in today's society. But again, all of this becomes instructional. It becomes Torah in the sense of, I believe in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, the most important thing that God saw was that he established who's in control, God. Who is the creator, God. What is his good creation? Everything that you see, man and woman, and now what's the context of those two coming together? Marriage. And unfortunately, I mean, this is why Genesis 1 and 2 preaches today. You want to know what's wrong with our society? We have undermined the three very fundamental things that holds the society together. That's apart from God.
Yeah.
If you're atheistic, that's one thing. I mean, you've taken out God out of the picture. But now what we have done is the very natural thing of Romans chapter 1. We have taken out family, marriage, and gender.
Yeah.
And once you take those out, chaos ensues.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting the way the Catholics would say it, and I'm not, I think there's more to it, but it's interesting that they approach some of the same-sex marriage as a disordering of all things. It just messes up everything, and it's obviously more than that. But I mean, I think that they may have nailed it on some of that because you start messing with the way God had ordered things, God's laws, and you start to disorder all of society. Like you said, today we're facing the disordered, and we're facing confusion and instability, and it's not a good thing.
And I think that goes back to the fact that we have jettisoned the Torah, and because that's Old Testament, that doesn't apply to us.
Yeah.
We can maybe argue around what Paul is doing with this whole idea of gender and sexuality, but I'm telling you, when you get to Genesis 1 and 2, it's hard to get around.
Right.
That what God has established in Genesis 1 and 2 is the order, what brings order to a culture. And what we are witnessing in our culture is disorder. It's simple.
Well, great, Brian. Thank you. Appreciate it. We'll come back in the near future and keep on going through the conversation through this book. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it.